Thank you so much, Julie. And thank you for inviting me to speak. It's an honor to be speaking here at My Jewish Learning. And it's a real honor to be seeing people from all over the world who have gathered together on Zoom. So after, approximately a year and a half of this, we have really learned to use Zoom to our advantage. And I think one of the great advantages is that we can have people sitting on the same Zoom from Wales and from Las Vegas and from Hudson Valley and here from Israel as well. So I'm really thrilled to see all of you here. And I want to talk a little bit about the Book of Lamentations. It's a really closed book. It's a hard book, right? And it's one of the reasons that I decided to write about it. I decided to write about it because it's a book which is a book of poetry. That already is difficult. It's difficult to read poetry in your own language. It certainly is difficult to read poetry in Hebrew, even for those who are proficient in Hebrew. Even for Israelis, it might surprise some of you to know that it's very difficult to understand the Book of Lamentations because it's not like reading the Book of Ruth, right? The Book of Ruth is a story. Anyone who is proficient in Hebrew can easily make their way through the Book of Ruth. And that's not the case with Lamentations. It's a difficult book. It's difficult in terms of its poetry. It's difficult in terms of its language. It's difficult in terms of its content as well, right? The subject matter of the Book of Lamentations, it's not a narrative. It's not a narrative. And of course, the subject, as often is the case with poetry, the subject is human emotion, right? Poetry is used. We'll talk maybe a little bit about poetry. I do have a chapter in my book about biblical poetry and particularly about the specifics of poetry in the Book of Lamentations. So I'm going to talk about that also a little bit today, but particularly poetry is used to convey emotions, to convey feelings. If I want my reader to know information, I might write a story. But if I want my reader to feel something, I might use poetry, right? Poetry is there in order to cause the readers to feel something. And what's particularly, I think, rather difficult about the Book of Lamentations is that, just as the name implies, it's not love poetry, right? It's not poetry which is inspiring in terms of its of the kinds of emotions that it's designed to produce, right? It's not about the Song of the Sea, which is about producing awe, or Song of Songs, which is about producing a sense of romance and love, right? It's about grief. It's about suffering. It is a book of lamentations, right? And so, on the one hand, that makes it a very difficult book. I spent, I would say, about 7 years writing this book. Writing a book, some of you may know, it's a very immersive experience. And to some degree, part of my struggle as I was writing the book was, also struggling with the kinds of emotions that are very present in the book, which are not easy emotions to experience. But, and here's, I think, perhaps the most important point that for me, in any case, when I was choosing to write this book, is that the emotion of grief is part of the human experience. And unfortunately, I think it's part of the human experience that we oftentimes are not equipped to deal with. I mean, certainly not even just as humans, and certainly not within the context of our religious experience. And that's what a biblical book is, right? A biblical book is not just, about coping with grief. It's not a self-help book. It's not, it's not a psychological study. It's rather a specific attempt to teach human beings who are in a relationship with God, who are contending with the presence of God in their life, how to contend with God, how to struggle with God within the context of human suffering. And because I think this is such a universal experience, I mean, at some point, hopefully later in life, rather than earlier, at some point, everybody experiences the death of a loved one. It's, certainly on an individual basis, every person experiences grief. And the Book of Lamentations, in my opinion, is about universal experience of grief, not just about the specific historical context in which the book is written, which I'll talk about in a moment. It's also about the experience of grief, not just on an individual basis, but also as a community. What happens when there's a national calamity? This is something certainly that I think has become particularly relevant in the last year and a half, right? When I started writing the book, COVID was the farthest thing from my mind. I probably didn't know the word pandemic, right? Oh, that's not true. We had a game called Pandemic, but that's what it was, right? It certainly wasn't something that we were entertaining as a real possibility. But on the other hand, the Jewish community has gone through many calamities as a community throughout our history. And of course, the Holocaust was, less than 100 years ago. And so these are things that we as a community have dealt with, we as a Jewish community have dealt with, and also we as the community of human beings, right? When COVID happens, it binds us all together around the world as human beings who are coping with tragedy, who are coping with suffering that seems in many ways to be indiscriminate suffering that causes us as religious human beings, and that's what the Bible is speaking to ask some of the preeminent theological questions. So even though the book of Eicha is not a how-to book, it certainly gives us the skills, the tools, and the language within which to cope with suffering. And for me, that was just, the reason, that was the draw, that was the reason that I wanted to write about the book of Eicha, really in order to give people that opportunity to see this biblical book, to try to realize its both usefulness and some of its beautiful and really, I think, extraordinary messages. So some of that we'll talk about today. I want to maybe just mention a little bit about the specific historical context of the book, because the book is not, it's not without a context, even though the book itself tries to remain somewhat ahistorical. When I say tries to remain somewhat ahistorical, I'll just point to a couple things. Number one, there are no names in the book. Not one name in the book. Not Jeremiah, not Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, not Zedekiah, the Judean king, right? Not any of the figures that we know are, walking around at the time of the calamity, of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 586 BCE. We know many of these figures. They are named in other biblical books, in the book of Kings, in the book of Jeremiah. No names appear in the book of Lamentations. That already makes the book a different sort of book. I mean, clearly the subject of the book throughout is the fall of Jerusalem. Clearly the subject of the book is the siege of Jerusalem, which lasted for a year and a half and wrought terrible havoc on the community, right? There was terrible starvation, terrible famine in the city. It's definitely one of the most poignant and painful themes of the book of Lamentations is the famine in the city and what it does to the people. And yet at the same time, the book itself remains somewhat ahistorical because it doesn't name people, because it doesn't have dates, because it doesn't really become too specific so that we can't see this book as being universally applicable. Okay, but what is the historical context, and why do we have this book of Lamentations specifically about this particular historical context when, really throughout the Bible, there are all sorts of calamities. There are, a bunch of different catastrophes. Why is this one so special or so important that it merits an entire book of Lamentations? So, I'll say something pretty sweeping about biblical history. Okay, biblical history pretty much starts with Abraham, right? In the 11th chapter of Genesis, when we finish that, kind of general universal history of the creation of the world and the flood and the Tower of Babylon, suddenly we meet this man, Abraham, and he's on a mission. And what is his mission? His mission is to get to the land of Israel. That's his mission. That's what God tells him. Lech lecha me'artzecha u'mimoladecha u'mibeit avicha el haaretz asher areka. Go from your homeland, go from your father's house to a land that I am going to show you. And that begins biblical history. That begins the history of the nation of Israel. And so that ultimately those first words that come really with God's blessing to Abraham is, I'm going to bless you, I'm going to make you a nation, and I'm going to give your nation a homeland. And so we move towards the land of Israel. Now, it takes a while to get there. There are kind of some bumps along the way. I think, many of you are aware that before we actually settle in the land of Israel, we make our way down to Egypt, where we're enslaved for, several hundred years, right? So it takes a while before we become a nation with political autonomy in the land. And that really only begins to happen in the book of Joshua, right? But from the book of Joshua, through the book of Judges, through the book of Samuel, all the way up to the end of the book of Kings, the nation of Israel is settled in their land. We have political autonomy. We have a Davidic dynasty, a dynasty of kings. We have a temple, which is all about realizing the goal of the nation of Israel, which is obviously also to create a relationship with God in the temple, and also to spread God's word to the world, right? The temple is seen as some kind of central locus, right? From whence goes forth God's word. And all of these things, these seem to represent the goal of biblical history. Now, what happens in 586 BCE, and it marks the culmination of a series of events, but what happens specifically in 586 BCE is that the Babylonians finally come into Jerusalem. They penetrate the holy city. They destroy all of the buildings in the city, including, of course, the temple. And they take all the people who are left, and a lot of people have either died because of the terrible starvation during the siege that lasted for a year and a half, or because they were killed by the Babylonians in their rather vicious rampage into the city of Jerusalem. Everybody who's left gets taken into exile. And thereby ends the story of biblical history. Or does it, right? It seems to end there. That, I think, is the point that I want to make first, which is that this event, it's so calamitous. It's so cataclysmic. It seems to represent the end of everything that the Bible has sort of posited that that's what we're working towards, right? And not only are we no longer in our land, and not only has the land been physically devastated, there's no more temple, so the people are spiritually disoriented. The social infrastructure of the people seems to have completely collapsed. Certainly the economic infrastructure of the people has completely collapsed. And what is left? What is left? Now, what I'm going to suggest is that in spite of the fact that we have this book of Lamentations, which is a lamentation not just over a specific event, but I think as many calamities are, it's a lamentation over a world that we believed in and that seems to be no longer, right? It's about the collapse of all of the dreams of the Bible, right? Now, what's extraordinary about the Bible, and I'm not going to talk about this too much, but I just want to throw it out there because I actually think it's one of the most wonderful ideas that appears in the broader view of the Bible. What's wonderful is that biblical history does not end there. It doesn't end there. We have many more books of the Bible that are written following this calamity, because following this calamity, we have the period of the return to Zion. We have books like Ezra and Nehemiah and Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi, right? All of these different books, they're all post-destruction. And so one of, I think, the great messages of the Bible is that calamity is not necessarily the end. It's not necessarily the end of the story. I mean, I think that these are some of the messages that enable us as, as a community to emerge from really terrible cataclysmic events like the Holocaust, right? Post-Holocaust, how does a community get back up on its feet and begin to, to build their dream again? I think that some of that ability is embedded in the Tanakh itself. It's embedded in the Bible. Okay, so that's, pretty much the historical context. If there are any questions until now, please raise your hand or write a question in the chat. If not, I'll go on and talk a little bit about the poetry in the book, because I mentioned that, this is, I don't see any hands up so far, so, I'm not going to pause, but if I do see any, I will pause. So, the story or the book of Echa is written in poetry. And I want to talk a little bit about that poetry because, of course, that's the medium through which we encounter the book. It's, I think, in many ways, a very evocative poetry. It's a very evocative medium once you get past some of the technicalities. And I'll mention a couple things about the poetry of the Book of Lamentations. I'm going to start by saying that what is most striking when we first encounter the book is that 4 out of 5 of the chapters, those are the first 4 chapters of the book, are written as alphabetic acrostics, right? I mean, it's very striking to the eye. When you look at the first verse, it starts with an aleph. The second verse starts with a bet. The third verse starts with a gimel, right? We have that in several places in Tanakh, not that many. Most of them are in the book of Psalms, but there are under 10, right? Under 10 compositions that are written with alphabetic acrostics in the book of Psalms, and we have 1 in the book of Mishlei, right? Also in wisdom literature, and we have 4 out of 5 of the books of the chapters of Lamentation are written as alphabetic acrostics. I see that Leslie asked a question. I'll get to you in one moment. First, I'm going to finish talking about the alphabetic acrostics, and then I'll address Leslie's question. Why alphabetic acrostics? I mean, many people have commented that this doesn't seem to be a great poetic technique because, of course, it kind of limits the freedom of the poet, right? You could say anything you want, but it has to start with an A, right? And you could say anything you want, but it must start with a B, right? So, there's something about that seems to be perhaps rather limiting. I'm going to say 2 things about these acrostics. Number 1, acrostics, as the Midrash notes, always expresses totality. Always from A to Z, we say, right? From Aleph to Taf. When I want to express something that is all encompassing, but I don't necessarily want to write, an endless book, what I might do is use an acrostic structure to say, basically, every single word in the vocabulary that starts with an aleph that could possibly express grief is subsumed under this letter aleph, right? It expresses totality, and that's what we have here, the totality of grief. But I'm going to say the opposite as well, and that is that I think the acrostics are here as well to give a certain kind of limit and structure to grief. Grief can so easily go, well up and overflow and lose control. And here we have almost this idea of creating a framework, right? I mean, that's what we do also in formal halacha, of informal Jewish law. When it comes to Jewish mourning, there are very clear guidelines. until the burial are the following ways that one grieves. From the burial for the 7 days of mourning, these are the guidelines for grieving. You then have 30 days, or you have another 23 days, which have other guidelines for grieving, right? And so this idea is that we allow the grief to well up and emerge, but we don't want it to become overwhelming. And so we give it a framework. Okay, so Rachel says that the Yom Kippur liturgy also has an alphabetic structure. And that is, I think, a wonderful comment, because it really also explains or it coheres with what I'm saying about totality. When we confess our sins on Yom Kippur, we do so in several different poetic compositions alphabetically, right? For those of you who are familiar, Ashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu, Dibarnu Dofi, He'evinu, Vihirshanu, etc., etc. I just did Aleph until Vav. And the idea is that when we stand before God, we can't possibly express all of our sins before God. And so we use an alphabetic acrostic in order to express a sense of totality. Okay, I've been asked by Ira to discuss the pay ayin issue, which I will in a moment. But first, I'm going to address Leslie's question, which goes back to the question of who wrote Lamentations. It goes back to what I was discussing before, where I said that there is no author, or there are no people named in the book of Eicha. So we actually don't know, according to the book, we have no idea who the author is. There is a very strong rabbinic tradition, and it's a tradition that appears in some very ancient texts, like, for example, some of the earliest translations of Lamentation, including the Greek translation, which was done in the 2nd century BCE, the translation known as the Septuagint. We have it also in our Aramaic Targumim, in our Aramaic translations, and really all over rabbinic literature. The assumption is that the author of the book of Lamentations is Jeremiah, which only leads, Jeremiah is a very familiar figure, and there are some really interesting linguistic correlations and linguistic overlaps between the book of Lamentations and the book of Jeremiah, which might further corroborate this identification. But I will just say that the more important question is, in my mind, not whether Jeremiah wrote it, but why we have no author. In other words, why we don't know this for sure, why the story, the book itself doesn't identify Jeremiah. And here I would say that it seems to me that there is an attempt to remove the author from the book of Lamentations, so that the sense is that there's a feeling of all of us are in the same boat together. Right? In other words, if we had the book opened with the words, "These are the Lamentations of Jeremiah," well, I'm already hearing it through the voice of a prophet, right? And a prophet, he stands outside of the nation. He's not exactly one of the gang, right? Sometimes he stands outside of the nation to rebuke. Sometimes he stands outside of the nation to console. But certainly he is not, necessarily perceived as one of the suffering nation. And so I think that the reason that his name may be removed from the book is because, in fact, he is we're not meant to read the book as if it's the prophet speaking. That might give us a totally different understanding of the book. Okay, Rachel says, is it thought that chapter 3 has a different author? This is a really good question. In academia, there are very vastly different approaches as to whether or not all of Lamentations is written by one author, or whether chapter 3 is different, is chapter 5 different, is each chapter written by a different author. The academia weighs in on all of these questions. I will say that according to rabbinic thought, and certainly our most famous rabbinic commentator, Rashi, says this at the opening of chapter 3, and that is that chapter 3 opens with the words, Ani HaGever, I am the man. And Rashi says, that is the story that Jeremiah is telling of his own life, of his own experience. So certainly according to rabbinic thought, chapter 3 is not just not written by a different author, but it's the most autobiographical chapter of all of the chapters written by Jeremiah. Okay, Naomi says, why he? There is certainly a woman's voice, and chapter 3 is a male voice, right? Absolutely. There are two different voices in the book of Eicha, right? Jerusalem is a female voice, right? All cities in Tanakh are female, right? And the word city in Hebrew is a feminine word, right? But there's a very strong female voice in the book. It's very evocative, right? Of course, the book opens by describing the city as a widowed city, right? A city who has unfortunately lost her husband. There's a bit of debate as to who is Jerusalem's husband. Is it God or is it the people of Israel? That, we won't get into right now. But there are two very strong voices in the book of, more than two, I would say, but certainly there's a strong female voice in Eicha, there's a strong male voice in Eicha. Okay, I'll just mention very briefly about the Peh and the Ayin, because I was asked that. I have a bit, it's not, I don't consider it to be a central point in my book. I have an appendix on it in the book. So I'll just mention very briefly that, in 3 out of 4 of the acrostic structures, there are 2 letters that are switched in terms of the order, the Peh and the Ayin. In other words, in our alphabet today, the Ayin comes before the Peh, right? And that's true in chapter 1 in Eicha. But in chapter 2, 3, and 4, the Peh comes before the Ayin. Now, Rabbinic Midrash has addressed this in a homiletical way, but I will just mention that we found quite a few what they call abecedaries, right? Alphabetic lists from ancient times in the land of Israel, from the 12th century BCE, from the 11th century BCE, and in most of them, the Peh comes before the Ayin, okay? So there is a certain fluidity in letter order that we're clearly seeing also in the book of Lamentations. For the moment, I'm not going to talk about the ramifications of that. It's not, I don't think, the most important point. I'm going to look for a moment at some, I see a bunch of questions here. Cynthia wrote, going back to the initial idea that poetry is for emotion and prose is for stories. The structure and language of poetry has always been used to communicate values and ideas. Poetry and song are especially valuable for these cultural transmissions in non-literate groups. I think that that's a very good point. Okay, so Naomi says she has not lost her husband. She is only like a widow, because if she had lost her husband, God would be dead. And that obviously is theologically untenable. And that's a point that Jeremiah makes very explicitly in chapter 51 of the book of Jeremiah, but we're not going to get into that now. Let me say a couple more things about the book of Lamentations, and then maybe we'll open up the floor for questions. When we look at some of the themes of the book of, actually, there was one more thing I wanted to say about the poetry, which I'm going to go back to the poetry for one moment. And that is, I want to say a word about meter. Meter is not the most interesting topic, right? Meter. Anybody who likes poetry likes meter, but it's not. I think most people are not really so attuned to meter. Although I think we would know. Oh, Cynthia says yes, meter. Okay, so good. Some people like meter, but I think we're all kind of familiar, sort of intuitively, that there are cadences in language, right? We know that. I can tell you as someone who moved to Israel at, in my 20s and not as a child, that the most frustrating thing I think for Israelis hearing me talk in Hebrew was that I oftentimes stressed the wrong syllable, and it was very annoying, right? You hear what I'm saying, right? When you stress the wrong syllable, you notice, right? But stressed syllables are a very important part of the cadence of our speech. And generally speaking, the book of Lamentations is, or no, I should say not the book of Lamentations. Generally speaking, biblical poetry consists of sentences, which are binary sentences. They're divided into two, and they have even meter. Even meter. They have the same amount of stressed syllables on the first side of the sentence as they do on the second side of the sentence. That's the way that biblical poetry works. However, it's not the way that the meter works in the Book of Lamentations. The Book of Lamentations has a very unique sort of play with meter. Okay, not all the sentences, but about 50% of the sentences in the Book of Lamentations have unequal meter in a very specific way. Okay, and I'll explain to you what I mean by a very specific way. The first part of the sentence has longer meter than the second part of the sentence. I'm going to read it for you so that I'll just read a couple sentences for you so you know what I mean, okay? Here's a sentence. It's from the 5th verse of the 1st chapter in Lamentations. Hayu sareha lirosh, oiveha shalu. Right? It doesn't end. The sentence doesn't end. You see what I'm trying to show? I'll give you another sentence, right? Oleleha halchu shvi lifnei tsar. Right? And you are the biblical listener, and you know that I'm supposed to finish that sentence. You don't even have to understand the words to understand that the Book of Lamentations is not finishing its sentences. This is such an important phenomenon that a Bible scholar in the 19th century, a German Bible scholar named Karl Buddha, dubbed this phenomenon lamentation meter. He called it lamentation meter. And he said that the effect, I'm going to read for a moment from my book, the effect is a peculiar imbalanced rhythm in which the second part of the sentence fades away. And now this is what I'm writing. This conveys the book's inability to finish its sentences, a condition produced by exhaustion and despair. Cut off midway, the speaker chokes back his final words of his litany of suffering, tapering off into a disconcerting silence. Echaz's lack of, the Book of Lamentations' sparse parallelism mirrors an imbalanced world where harmony no longer prevails. Okay, so that, I mean, I think that's part of the techniques that are being used in the Book of Lamentations in order to produce a feeling of grief, right? You're hearing remember also, we all have books today. We are very privileged. You know, we have these bookshelves filled with books. People in the ancient world weren't necessarily as fortunate, and in order to get to know the biblical books, they would listen to them, right? That's why we would read biblical books out loud. And so I think we've lost something in the fact that we tend to read things with our eyes. Sometimes we miss those nuances. Okay, now all right, you know what, Marty, at the end, I'll talk about who is the primary audience for my book. I'm going to say a couple more things about the themes of the book, right? You know, there's not a lot of focus on sin in the book. There is some focus on sin, but there's not a lot of focus on sin. The book is more about suffering. It's about desolation, destruction, loneliness. There's a lot of descriptions of famine and pain, you know, the failures of particularly religious leadership, right? You know, the suffering of the innocent. But what I think that the book really wants to do is to contend with God's role in all of this. And the way that it contends with God's role in all of this is, I think marvelously complex, right? I think that one of the reasons that I'm drawn to the Bible and to the biblical books is because it produces, I think, a very sophisticated view of human beings. It sets the bar very high, but it still has a particularly, I think, realistic view of human beings. And that's really throughout the Bible, and particularly in the book of Lamentations, we have a very complex portrayal of God, right? On the one hand, we have God, who's portrayed as, I'm going to say the word enemy, because that word appears 3 times about God in the book of Lamentations. You know where else that word appears about God in the Bible? Only in one other place. This is a very rare, unusual, and disturbing depiction of God's relationship to his people. Now, again, there the word also is used like. God was like an enemy. I don't know about you, that doesn't calm me that much, right? I mean, the word enemy, when juxtaposed to God, is very disturbing. So that's one portrayal of God. But the other portrayal of God in the book is that God is just. Tzaddik hu Hashem, kifihu mariti. God is righteous. I rebelled against him, right? Human beings are nothing if not faithless to God, right? I mean, that's one of the great themes of the Bible. And so what we have here in this, I think, really kind of elaborate depiction is a very balanced posture in the approach to the problem of God's role in human suffering. Now, I'm just going to read for you one passage. I'll say one more thing, and then we'll conclude, and I'll take all your questions. I'm going to read a passage. It's as follows. On the one hand, Lamentations articulates intense anger at God, generated by acute awareness of the capriciousness of death, the triumph of evildoers, and the suffering of the innocent. However, the book of Lamentations also assumes a measured pose, allowing a second approach to emerge from the turmoil, one that concludes that God remains just, even if events suggest otherwise. I think that this complexity is really the heart of the message that Lamentations gives us. It's an honest portrayal, right? The book says, I have a simple faith in God's justness because I'm a religious person, and I can't live in a world in which I don't believe in God's justness. That for me would be a world, I'm speaking personally now, that would be an absurd world, a world that I don't want to live in. On the other hand, I look around and I see events that don't always match my belief that God always acts with perfect justness. I see a building collapse in Miami. I see Corona, COVID, rip through the world. And so what we're experiencing in the book of Lamentations is a complex kind of oscillation between these 2 poles that the book holds so dear. Honesty with the world around us, which sometimes produces a baffled, even outraged posture before God, and yet at the same time, a deep sense of faith in God. And so the last thing that I want to point out is that, the most frequently asked question about my book so far, it's only been out for a month. Starry Night. Why Starry Night? What does that have to do with Lamentations? So what I really want to say about the book of Lamentations is that Lamentations is a turbulent world, right? And it's a storm. And the human being lives with a storm that revolves around him. And yet there is in chapter 3, the eye of the storm, the heart of the book, where human beings find tranquility. What you find in the middle of chapter 3, the middle of the book, right at its center, you find the only actual grappling with theology in the book. And it is a wonderful grappling for two reasons. First of all, because it concludes that God is compassionate. And even if today you don't see his compassion, tomorrow you will. But more importantly, because what's really at the center of the book is not God, but humans, right? What the book is really doing at its very center is allowing human beings to look to their own center of their being, the center of themselves, and to find faith in God, but more importantly, faith in themselves, faith in their ability to live in a world where a storm swirls around, but where within the inner recesses of our being, we can find tranquility. What appears at the center of the center of the center is the word tov 3 times in a row. Tov, tov, tov. It is a surprising thing that at the center of the book of Lamentations, what is featured there is the word good, right? The world around us seems to be bad, but the center, there we find good. And I think it is a wonderful message. I think it's a very powerful message. It's a very optimistic message in a book that I wouldn't call optimistic. What lies at the center is a certain deep optimism. Okay, so now I'm gonna open to questions. Maybe I'll just answer some of the questions that I've seen so far, but please feel free to just dive in. I think Julie, you're gonna open their microphones. Is that okay? Okay, so someone asked me, who's the primary audience for the book? Marty asked that, which is a really good question, because everyone who's ever written anything, an article, a book, knows that you have to have a picture of who you're talking to, right? So, for me, this book was written actually with 2 separate audiences in mind. On the one hand, I was talking to my own community in which I live, which is a modern Orthodox community where I live, where I teach, where I've been teaching the Book of Lamentations for 30 years at this point. And I was using a lot of rabbinic sources to try to tease out of the book those ideas which I think are inspiring and which are spiritually uplifting. That was one goal. I use a lot of academic sources as well. I'm academically trained. I'm interested always in seeing the convergence between academia and the traditional sources. So that's something I did in my Ruth book, and it's something which I also tried to do in my book on Lamentations. But the other audience that I had in mind, and this, I alluded to at the beginning of this talk, the other audience that I had in mind was just human beings. I mean, it was, first of all, it was surprising for me that when I did write the book of Ruth, that I found that, it was able to appeal to many different types of people in different communities. And that was for me very inspiring and very exciting. So when I wrote the Book of Lamentations, I had in mind, I didn't write the Book of Lamentations. When I wrote my book on Lamentations, I had in mind that, I hope and I would be very gratified if anybody who is suffering and thinking about what it means to be a religious person, or not even formally a religious person, but a person seeking spirituality, and wants to understand how that bears on our relationship with God, our fundamental understanding with God. I would hope that they would also find inspiration in this book. I would like, and I tried for this book to be able to appeal to that broader audience. But again, I did use many traditional rabbinic sources. That was really very much part of what I was trying to focus on. Okay, question. I see Monique has a question, but let me just look up again. Okay, so Monique has a question. How does the eye of the storm in Lamentations connect with the whirlwind in the book of Job? And that's an interesting question, because one of the things that I didn't use was the word whirlwind, right? Because I didn't want to get confused. Instead of saying faith in a whirlwind, which was to me the obvious title, I said faith in a turbulent world, right? That whirlwind seems to be more about the theophany, with Job. And certainly you can talk about what that means, that the theophany happens, in a whirlwind. But here, the whirlwind that I'm talking about is very much in the world of humans, right? This is a book about humans. And, in the book of Lamentations, there's no God. And no, that's not true that there's no God, but there's no active role of God. No, that's not true either. God doesn't enter of his own accord. That's what I mean. God doesn't speak. God doesn't respond. It's all about humans and how we perceive God in our lives. In fact, the only time that God speaks in the entire book of Lamentations is when the Gever, the man in chapter 3, cites God speaking. But it's almost as though the Gever is finding God's word deep in himself, right? So, Angelina says that lamenting moves us back to faith. I think that there is a certain amount of truth in that. Something that I wrote at the very end of my book is that the experience of loss, of grief, it represents an opportunity to dig deeper into the nature of humans, of our relationship with God. I wrote that suffering produces introspection, and an examined life generates purposeful existence. And so what ends up happening is that calamity doesn't necessarily destroy one's convictions. Instead, it can enable us to discover them. So I think that that's what Angelina was suggesting. And that's why I called it faith in a turbulent world, which is kind of a double entendre, right? It's faith while we're within a turbulent world, but it's also faith in a world that is turbulent, right? It's an active kind of faith in something. So Nancy says, what about the small still voice in Ezekiel? Or the small still voice that we have with Elijah, right, on Har Chorev in the second book of Kings. That's how we find, I think, that's how we find God. Certainly in the book of Lamentations, we find it in a certain kind of silence. And how does the book open? The book opens Echa Yashva Vadad. Ha'ir Rabati Am, the city sitting alone. That word badad appears twice in the book, once in the opening verse, and the second time in the middle of chapter 3. In chapter 3, verse 27, in the middle of the middle of the middle. And it gives advice to humans. Yeshev vadad vidom ki natal alav. When he is suffering, he should sit quietly and alone. And Nancy adds, like quarantine, right? That there is something that's a really good point. I wasn't thinking that, but that's a good point, right? There's something about maybe even the loneliness of this year, some of the disconnect, which was very painful, for many people and very difficult. But at the same time, maybe forced us to look inward and to introspect, and or certainly could have given us that possibility for introspection. So that's, I think, a really good point. Monique wants to know what I said. Okay, so I'll repeat it again. It's really the last line in my book, so you can find it there pretty easily. Suffering produces introspection, and an examined life generates purposeful existence. Well, the third to last sentence in my book. Okay, any other questions? I could go on and on about Lamentations. As you see, it's a pretty thick book. It's well over 500 pages. So there's a lot to say about this book, and I think really because it kind of strikes at the heart of what it means to be human, and what it means to be a struggling human. So it's really about everybody.